Welcome to today's webinar, Indigenous Evaluation Models. This webinar is being recorded and should be available in approximately 2 weeks. This webinar is being hosted by the Eastern Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. We're one of 4 regional technical assistance providers. You can find out much more about the services that we provide by visiting our website. We do have counterparts in Alaska, the West, and the Pacific Basin. When you visit our site, you'll also find links to those TA centers. There are 2 handouts available for this webinar. You'll find them on the dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't see the dashboard, you should see a little orange arrow at the top left of your screen. If you click that, that'll open up that dashboard. One of the handouts is entitled Webinar PPD Handout, and that is the PowerPoint slides along with a notes area. We also have another handout that is a draft. It says Draft ME Toolkit. That is a draft monitoring and evaluation toolkit which was created by the Administration for Native Americans. Again, right now it is in the draft format. It's still being worked on to finalize, and when it is finalized, it will be posted on ANA's website. It's a good idea to try to download that now. There's quite a bit of information covered in this webinar, which is further detailed in that toolkit. My name is Candy Carmi, and I'm a Technical Assistance Specialist with the Eastern Region. I've been working with both applicants and grantees for the past 11 years, and I'm from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. Today we're going to talk about the importance of evaluation in our communities. We're going to go over why evaluate, the history of evaluation in our communities, Indigenous evaluation. We'll talk about the Administration for Native Americans and evaluation in ANA programs. We'll take a look at internal versus external evaluation. Should you conduct your evaluation, or should you hire an outside evaluator? We'll discuss creating an evaluation plan and sharing those results or your story. Because we're just touching the tip of the iceberg with this webinar today, we'll provide you some resources so that you can research the topics and hopefully clarify any questions that you may have. And lastly, we'll open up the webinar to your questions. So let's get started. I want to ask a question of you first. And there's, any of you ever created a project evaluation plan? If you could just select your response. I'll leave this open for a second or two. Wow, it looks like right now, it looks like more of you have than have not, but let's see what, there's still some people that are making a selection. So it looks like more of you have created an evaluation plan than haven't. I'm hoping that today's webinar will provide you with some useful information that hopefully you can put in your toolkit and use for future evaluation. And for those of you that are new, I'm hoping that we can help you to see that evaluation is not something to be feared. So, if I was to ask you why evaluate, a lot of you would come up with the response that you have to, that if you don't provide an evaluation plan, you're not going to get points in your with your application. As a technical assistance provider, I've seen quite a few applications where it was very evident that the grant writer just wanted to get something in there. And I've also seen applications that only had maybe a paragraph or two on evaluation, and even some that say something like, once we get funded, we'll create an evaluation plan. You really need to do a 180 with your perspective if that's the way that you look at evaluation. And you need to, instead of thinking of evaluation as a chore or a necessary evil, think of it as just another step in implementing your project. It's a tool to tell the story of your project and is key to managing it. Evaluation can tell you if you accomplished your project goal, objectives, and intended outcomes. Did you do what you planned to do? It's a way to determine if your project was meaningful for participants or project beneficiaries. Did your project have any impact, and what were the impacts, and how did you accomplish them? Your evaluation results can be shared with your community, your leadership, and your funder to show how effective your project was. And evaluation can be a tool to form future project design. Remember that evaluation is not just about demonstrating success, it's also about figuring out what does and does not work. So why are we talking about this now? ANA's funding opportunity announcements will probably, again, this is a guesstimate, be published sometime around the end of the year. And ANA typically has them out for about 90 days. So with that timeline, you definitely have time now to start working on developing your project, and you also have that time to create an evaluation plan that measures the impact of your project and is also going to be something that is meaningful to your community. In the not-so-distant past, evaluation was usually conducted by outside evaluators. Our communities had little or no role in determining what was going to be evaluated. And when the results came in, sometimes we got them, sometimes we didn't, and then sometimes it was after the fact. For many in our community, there was a concern that negative findings could result in funds being reduced, or that a program would be judged harshly, and we would be judged harshly. Many evaluations in the past focused on project deficits and not on the strengths. And because no input was provided by the community, the results were not seen as significant. For evaluations that required interviewing or talking to community members, there was often a distrust factor, which impacted the amount of information evaluators could gather. To counter this history, tribes and Native organizations started looking at how our values and communities could be used to tell the story of our projects. Evaluation is not something new to us. We have a history of evaluating what does and does not work. An Indigenous evaluation plan should include cultural and community values, and your community should be included in that process. When you're designing your evaluation plan, you select the tools and methods that work best for your project and your community. It might be using a canned survey, or it might be designing one from scratch. It might be the inclusion of stories from project participants. However you design your evaluation plan, because you created it using tools and methods that you and your community selected, you have ownership of that plan. The Administration for Native Americans has been a long-time proponent of incorporating these concepts in project evaluation. If you're familiar with the administration for Native Americans, you know that projects are based on a problem statement that was identified as a priority by your community. You had some kind of community process, whether it was community meetings, focus groups, you conducted a survey. Through some kind of process, you solicited input from your community and came up with what the community priorities are. Then you selected one of those priorities and used that as the basis of your project, with a goal being either to alleviate or reduce that problem that you identified. ANA does require an evaluation plan, but for the most part, the design is left up to you. One thing to note, though, is that you really need to read the funding opportunity announcements for whatever source of funding you're seeking. For example, with ANA, in the last two language funding opportunity announcements, the Esther Martinez Immersion and the Preservation and Maintenance FOAs, ANA has required the inclusion of a program performance evaluation plan. There's almost a page worth of information on what ANA is looking for. So if you plan to submit a language application, make sure that you read that section. But you really do need to read the announcements fully of whatever funding source you're going to be applying to. And lastly, ANA asks you to include community involvement throughout your project. You don't just go and solicit input at the front end. You have community involvement woven throughout the implementation of your project. You provide the community updates on your project, and you also solicit input at the end of the project. The community is involved throughout your project. Because you're familiar with your project and your staff and your project participants and your beneficiaries, you're in that perfect position to monitor and evaluate your project. Also, since you're monitoring the project, it's much easier for you to determine that you need to take some kind of corrective actions, and it's quicker. It's cost-effective because project staff are implementing the monitoring and evaluation. And actually, ANA would prefer that you conduct your evaluation. And as a matter of fact, the Sustainable Employment and Economic Development Strategies, or SEEDS FOA, it actually states that you can't use project funds for an external evaluation. It can be costly to hire an external evaluator. You have to interview them and you have to contract with someone, which could also be time-consuming. If you absolutely have to use an external evaluator, it's a good idea to research them during your project development and perhaps even reach out to a few to get enough additional information on the services that they provide. And it would probably also be a good idea to maybe get a price quote from them. This time spent could save you time later. Evaluators often are not culturally competent, or they have little knowledge of your community, which means that they have to spend some time ramping up and familiarizing themselves with both your community and your project. We have heard from some grantees who had difficulties getting results from their evaluators, and there's actually been some who didn't receive the evaluation results at all. That's a problem when you pay for something and then you don't get that end product. I really can't emphasize enough, you're going to hear it a lot in this webinar, you really need to thoroughly read funding opportunity announcements. There are some funders who require an external evaluation, so you need to be aware of that. There are also some instances where you're probably going to need an outside evaluator. Let's say you're creating a training and a curriculum that you plan to make available to tribes and organizations throughout the country. Or you're trying to prove that you have expertise in a particular subject area. Then you're probably going to need an external evaluation in order to receive an objective analysis of the effectiveness of your training or your program. So let's say your project is this canoe. Everything is going great. The water looks clear and the sky is blue, and your project is progressing on track. You don't want to be paddling past this sign and have to wait for your evaluator to forward you a report, call you, or send you an email telling you to turn around. You want to be in control of the situation and make that decision to change your course in order to get your project back on track. So let's try another question. I know we haven't gotten to it yet, but let's try and see what your responses are to this question. So it looks like most of you got the answer right. That's great. That means that you do have even though some of you are new to this, you do have a good idea of what's required. So let's go over exactly how to create an evaluation plan. When you're creating an evaluation plan, as I said at the beginning, you should have a problem statement and up to 3 SMART objectives already developed. Now, if you recall, ANA allows you a maximum of 3 objectives, and they need to be in that SMART format, or specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. You should have a logic model handy if you created one when you were developing your project, or you try to create one if you haven't already. We did have a webinar 2 weeks ago on logic models. A lot of funders are looking for them now. If you would like to get more information on logic models, you can view the webinar. It is recorded and it is on our website. It's a good way to get more information on creating logic models. Most logic models are 1 page. They are a picture of your project. Most of them, like I said, do try to get all the information on 1 page, and most of them do have the components shown here. Those are inputs, which are the resources dedicated to the project. It could be your project staff, volunteers, partners, office space, things like that. Your activities are what you plan to do. Again, since the logic model is 1 page, you want to identify your key activities. They could be things like creating a language curriculum for 3rd grade, or training participants for positions in the construction industry, or developing environmental codes. Outputs are the direct products of your project activities. Examples could be train 30 participants, or create 2 lesson plans, record 10 traditional stories, recruit 25 volunteers to clean up the riverbank. Notice how when I was identifying outputs that I included numbers in those. You want to, when you're designing your project, you want to try to put numbers in your outputs so that, and take a look at your project design first of all and make sure and kind of try to wrap your arms around what is a feasible number. You do want to include numbers when you're designing your logic model, and you're going to use that in your evaluation plan. Outcomes are the benefits both during and after you've completed your project activities. It could be something like an increase in participant income as a result of getting a better position because of training the participants received. Or it could be an increase in language proficiency. Or it could be something like the decrease in the number of a particular invasive species. Both your logic model and your objectives should contain numbers. And when you're creating your evaluation plan, you want to refer to the logic model and look at the activities, the outputs, and the outcomes you've identified to determine how you will assess if you've accomplished them or not. When you're creating your evaluation plan, again, have that logic model handy if you have one, or take a look at your outputs and outcomes. Which elements are you going to evaluate? A formative evaluation is looking at your activities and/or outputs. It's typically done around the middle of a project because you're looking at processes. If you're going to be looking at your outcomes and/or impact, that's known as a summative evaluation, and most times you're looking at that towards the end of the project. An effective evaluation is going to combine both formative and summative evaluation. It's about learning what is helpful to improve the project while telling the whole story. This is not to say that you're only going to be evaluating your project at the midpoint or at the end. You really need to keep your eye on all the moving pieces of the project at all times in order to head off any potential problems. Now you need to look at what data do you need to collect to determine that you're meeting those numbers you identified in your outputs, your objectives, and how are you going to assess that you've met your proposed outcomes. For example, if you're creating something, how did you create it? How long did it take? Who created it? And was it effective? If participants are involved, you need to determine what information you need to get from them. You also are going to need to figure out how you're going to determine that they attended activities, how long they attended, how did you recruit them? Were there any barriers to recruitment? If you're teaching a skill, how are you going to determine that your participants mastered the skill? You next need to look at who will information be coming from. Is it going to come from the participants directly, project staff, family members, teachers, the community? You should try to include both qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data deals with descriptions and is data that can be observed but not measured. One thing that we see in a lot of applications is that the project will increase the participants' self-esteem. That would be qualitative. Quantitative data deals with numbers and is data that can be measured. So when you're designing your evaluation plan, you might want to include qualitative narratives and stories, as well as quantitative measures such as surveys or test scores to provide a full picture of your project. One thing to remember is that if you're collecting any kind of confidential information from your participants, ANA requires that you have a plan for keeping that information secure and that you also have a plan for destroying the information at the end of your project. So once you've determined what information you need to collect, you now need to decide how you're going to collect it. So let's go over some ways to collect information. Interviews involve creating a list of open or close-ended questions that you're going to ask individuals and take notes on their responses. A benefit of interviews is that it's pretty flexible and they can be done in person. You can do them on the phone or by using FaceTime or something like Skype. This could be a useful way to get information from elders. Surveys are another way to get specific questions answered that relate to your project. You can either use an existing survey or create one of your own. If you're designing your own survey, you need to take some time in developing it so that you capture all the information that you're looking for. Bear in mind that most of us are being bombarded by surveys. If you call your insurance agent, you're going to get a request to complete a survey after the call. If you go to a retail store, you get a request to complete a survey. So you want to make sure that you balance getting the information that you need with brevity. You don't want to have to conduct or prepare another survey later on because you missed capturing information. And you also don't want to have your recipients ignore the survey because it's too darn long. A good thing about surveys is that you can reach a lot of people quickly, especially if you use a web-based survey tool. You create your survey online. It usually produces something like a URL link. You can put that onto your website, or you can send that link out directly to your participants in an email. And what's really neat is that once you send it out, that web tool will also compile the information for you. Focus groups are usually 6 to 12 people that are interviewed about a specific topic or an issue. This is a good way to get information from a large sample of people, especially beneficiaries. Sometimes it's difficult to get everyone to participate, especially if you have someone who monopolizes the conversation. And I know we've all experienced that kind of situation. That person can also sometimes influence the group's responses. So you need to put on your facilitation cap when you encounter that in a focus group in order to tease out responses from the more quiet members of the group. Community meetings, we've all been to those, are larger groups. These meetings can sometimes be difficult to facilitate due to the number of people involved and any time constraints and the issue that you're discussing. So again, a good facilitator is a plus to keep the meeting on track and on topic. Including stories in your evaluation can be very powerful. I visited a language immersion project that was for 3 to 4-year-olds. And I spent the morning viewing the class. I sat in and I watched some of their activities, visited with the teachers, and then there was a meeting with some tribal leadership, some of the language department and cultural staff, the language teachers, and some of the parents were also in attendance. And one of the parents stood up and said that their 4-year-old child was able to recite traditional prayers. And the parent commented that the parent didn't speak the language. And not only was the child able to recite the traditional prayer, they were also able to present it at a community meeting. This kind, including stories like this, is, again, very powerful and very impactful. And as I was, of course, now that project is over, but it would have really been, again, very powerful if a number of parents had shared their stories on how the project impacted their children and their families. Tests or assessments are used when you're trying to determine how a participant's knowledge of a subject has increased. Typically, assessments are used for language projects where you're using something like a language fluency scale to determine what level of proficiency students have. Typically for a test, depending on what you're providing instruction on, For language projects, you definitely want to do a pre-test and you want to do a post-test. Again, depending on your project, it'll determine what type of testing is warranted. But for language projects, you want to be able to determine where your participants were when they started the project and where they were at the conclusion of the project. Whether you're creating or modifying tools, you want to test them out before using them. And if you're using existing tools, that's fine, or you can create your own tools. It's really up to you. You need to determine what works best for your project. So let me give you an example. Many grantees and language programs use the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Language guidelines for assessing a student's language skills. And there's nothing wrong with this. But we're seeing a number of language programs that are taking the ACTFL scales and modifying them to their language and to meet their community's requirements for language. So to make it your own, you might say that mastery of a certain complex verb in your language puts you at one level. But we're seeing this more and more that tools and assessments are being modified. Again, remember that you need a good idea is to run any kind of tools that you're creating by project staff, any advisory boards that maybe you've created, participants, community members, to make sure that not only are you capturing all the information that you need to assess about your project, but that there isn't any kind of offensive wording, confusing or ambiguous questions, or perhaps even something that is culturally inappropriate. So let's try another question. If you could respond to that one, see what you think. Okay, it looks like about all of you have responded. So in this instance, it's actually, the answer would be all of these would be effective ways to get information as to whether or not the individual received whatever cultural knowledge that you were providing, whether it's anything from creating traditional canoes or learning a specific language, increasing their knowledge on traditions that are specific to your community. Whatever it is, there's a number of ways that you can capture whether or not that they actually did learn it or not. So when you're creating your evaluation plan, you also want to include community involvement. And you might want to think about creating a community advisory board of stakeholders, such as elders, staff, partners, maybe staff from other departments, who can provide expertise and guidance on your evaluation and your project's implementation. You need to look at your project design and determine how often you intend to collect data. It shouldn't all be gathered at the end of your project. You need to plan to collect it over the course of implementing the project. And you also need to make monitoring routine. As you collect information, compile it. This graphic reminds me of another project that I visited. It was close to the end of the project, and it was focused on keeping young fathers engaged with their children. And there was a lot of different types of activities. They did everything from helping young men who hadn't completed high school get their GEDs. There was assistance with job skills like interviewing and resume writing. There were visits to colleges. There were field trips for the families. There was relationship counseling with the young men and the mothers of their children. Just a lot of different activities. When I visited the project director had come on of relatively recently. So when I asked any kind of questions, they usually had to defer to the other project staff. And this was mainly because that while the project had collected information throughout the project, there was attendance records and evaluations and assessment sheets, there was all kinds of information. They had never compiled it. It was all sitting in file folders. Now, had they compiled the information as they were going along, it would have really helped that new project director determine if the project was on track. But it also would have been a tool for the project staff to see if they were on track. It's too late to make any changes to your project's implementation if you're taking a look at your data at the end of your project. Plus, who wants to get handed all those file folders and have to compile all that data? That's why you want to keep on top of your data and analyzing it as you gather it. Once you've gathered information from your project, you're going to analyze and interpret your results. You should look at your project implementation activities and compare what was planned to what actually occurred. For example, let's say you indicated that you were going to have 8 training sessions. Did you have 8, or did you have maybe 5 training sessions? And why did this happen? Or if you were going to hire a particular staff position in the first 2 months of your project, but you didn't bring someone on until closer to the end of the year, why did that happen? And did that impact meeting your objectives? If you had project participants, you need to determine if the expected participant changes occurred. You should also include information on participants who didn't complete the project or dropped out. If you projected that, let's say, 25 tribal members would be employed, did that happen? And how did you determine that? Or if you expected that language proficiency for students would increase 1 full level, did that happen? And how did you determine that this happened? Much of your evaluation is going to be in a narrative format, but some of your results can best be shown by using graphs and charts. There is a lot more information on pulling together your analysis in that handout that I mentioned, Draft M&E Toolkit. And again, that was created by ANA. If you haven't already downloaded, I would recommend that you do that. Typically, you'll create an evaluation report with the information that you've compiled over the course of your project. The information that you can include in your evaluation report is dependent on who you'll be providing your information to. For example, if you need to provide a report to your funder, it's probably going to be the most comprehensive report that you're going to prepare. It may include detailed information about the project, the evaluation design, the type of data analyses that you conducted, how you collected data, what tools you created and used, a description of the results, how you met your project goal and your objectives, and any challenges that you encountered. An evaluation report to project or department staff doesn't need to focus so much on the evaluation design, but will probably focus more on your findings for future or ongoing program efforts. Any issues that affected the outcome and how they were addressed would probably also be included, along with a discussion on your results. If you're providing a report to your leadership or your board of directors, they typically are pretty busy and may not have time for a full briefing, so you might want to prepare a synopsis of the project along with the results, and that probably will fit the bill. And you could also let them know that a full report is available and can be forwarded to them. That way they can determine how much information they want to review on the project. An evaluation report to your community might focus more on the results and how they impacted participants. Once you get your report prepared, there's a number of ways to share it. You can put it on your website. You can produce a press release or an article for your newsletter or your local newspaper. You could have meetings, again, with your leadership, or maybe with other departments. Or you could hold an open house or have a community potluck where you share a brief video or PowerPoint on the project and have participants share their stories on what the project meant to them. So, in conclusion, your evaluation plan should be responsive to both your project and your community. Something to bear in mind is that your evaluation plan is not set in stone. You can modify it as data comes in from your community, your participants, and your beneficiaries. That survey that you designed might not be very effective, and you might need to either scrap it or come up with something else. That's fine. You don't have to live with what you designed initially. And as we're concluding this, I think that you probably have a pretty good idea that an evaluation plan does take some time to develop. But I think that if you use these steps as guidelines, and if you refer to the resources I've provided, I think you'll come up with an evaluation plan that will help guide your project's implementation and hopefully help you to determine its effectiveness. And that is time well spent. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, you do have time now if you're planning on submitting an ANA application in the upcoming competition. We do have project planning and development trainings in 3 of the 4 regions going on right now. During a project planning and development training, you work on designing a project and developing it with community input, and we also go over evaluating your project. They are free trainings. If you're interested in attending a project planning and development training, visit one of these websites and you'll find out the specifics on how to register and more information on specifically where they're being held. We do have webinars. They're usually held every other Thursday, and they're on a variety of topics. Webinar recordings can be found on ANA's website. When you go to their website, if you select the Resources tab, there's a search box there. Enter in the word webinars, and you'll come up with a full list of recorded webinars. The next webinar actually isn't going to be in 2 weeks. It's going to be in 3 weeks. We have a meeting the week that we would typically be having the next webinar. The webinar is going to be hosted by the Pacific Region Training and Technical Assistance Center, and the topic is Indigenous Production and Marketing of Native Goods. If you'd like to register for that training, their website is on the screen. As I mentioned previously, we just touched on the topic of evaluation. There's a lot of information out there on evaluation, and there's also information on Indigenous evaluation. The first resource on the screen is really a great one to use to see the full breadth and value of Indigenous evaluation. The bullet that says how to create an effective survey, that's a little 2-page handout that has really good tips to keep in mind when you're creating a survey. And the last bullet is really a great source on evaluation in general. It is over 100 pages in length, but it is very user-friendly. And if you're someone who's new to evaluation, it's just something good to have handy when you're getting started with creating an evaluation plan. So I'm going to open up the floor now to any questions that you may have. Rondell is going to be joining us, and we'll see what questions that you have. Rondell?
Okay, I have one question that has just come in, Candy. In what ways have you seen evaluation planning change?
Thanks for the question. I think what we're seeing now is that typically when people were designing evaluation plans, they used solely Western evaluation methodologies. But now we're seeing a melding of using our methods of evaluation or incorporating our community's input into evaluation and meld that with Western forms of evaluation. And I think that's really something that I'm seeing more and more recently. We also have a question, how are our objectives and outcomes different? Objectives are overarching statements. And objective is typically in the, like I said, the SMART format. And it would be something like by the end of 36 months, we will have increased language fluency in 15 participants by 1 fluency level. It's an overarching concept that covers a number of activities. Now, if you're looking at an objective, the outcomes are going to be things like that fluency increase. If your fluency increase would be one of those outcomes. But an objective, again, it's an umbrella statement that covers a number of activities. Hopefully that answers your question. And that looks like it is about it for our questions. Well, thank you for taking time to join us today. We hope that you can join us again on an upcoming webinar. Again, this webinar is recorded and you can view it again in about 2 weeks. Again, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us again on another webinar. Thank you.